Neversoft Entertainment was an American video game development studio founded in July of 1994 by Joel Jewett, Mick West and Chris Ward, the three of which were former employees of Malibu Interactive, the video game division of Malibu Comics. Shortly after their founding, the small team of just three began work on their first game, which would be a 2D hack-and-slash platformer based on the short-lived Skeleton Warriors cartoon series. This game would feature pre-rendered character sprites, which was a very popular method at the time to create 3D-looking characters in a 2D environment. Originally, the game was planned to be released on the then-aging Sega Mega Drive, aka Genesis, and Super Nintendo. But however, these versions were ultimately cancelled due to their publisher, Playmates Interactive, wanting to abandon the old 16-bit consoles for good and start over from scratch on the then upcoming new 32-bit consoles. And so the prototype that Neversoft had built for about 5 months for the Mega Drive was completely scrapped and development restarted from the ground up on the Sega Saturn in 1995. Skeleton Warriors would finally see release in early 1996, first on the Sega Saturn, and then a few months later it was ported over to the also recently released Sony PlayStation. The game proved to be a decent success, and the company quickly grew to over 20 employees. Shortly after Skeleton Warriors' release, Neversoft began work on multiple different projects all at the same time. One of these was a 2D Ghost Rider game for Crystal Dynamics, and the other was a PC-only strategy game called Tab, which the only known evidence of that game's existence is from a single page from Neversoft's own website back in '96, which thankfully, thanks to the Wayback Machine, has been archived. Both of these games were unfortunately cancelled due to financial issues. In 1997, Neversoft were developing a new IP called Big Guns, a 3D run-and-gun mech shooter for the PlayStation, which was made using their own internal game engine. The game would later be bought by Sony Computer Entertainment and renamed to Exodus, with a ton of changes along the way, such as the mech robots being replaced in favour of a girl who could turn into a cat. Yes, really. But unfortunately, even being brought by Sony, this game would also never see the light of day. However, before its cancellation, Neversoft were actually working on another project in the background. They were tasked with bringing over Shiny Entertainment's MDK from the PC over to the PlayStation. The port took a lot longer to develop than the team initially realised, but thankfully, unlike Ghost Rider, Tab and Big Guns, this game actually did see a release in November of 1997. During this time, however, the studio was in a really bad financial place. They were bleeding money due to all the cancelled projects they were working on, and their staff had shrunk from over 20 employees down to just 12, and they were very much on the verge of bankruptcy. However, luck would soon struck when in early 1998, Activision were looking for a studio to finish up production on a failed internal project called Apocalypse, which was a game that was very similar actually to Big Guns, as it was also a 3D run-and-gun shooter. Apocalypse featured the voice of legendary Hollywood actor Bruce Willis, initially as a sidekick character before being moved on as the main protagonist of the game. Neversoft signed on to the project and Apocalypse was eventually finished and released by the end of that year. Activision was impressed with Neversoft's work on the game and requested the studio to immediately begin work on their next project. They specifically requested a prototype for a skateboarding game, as Activision wanted to capitalise on the rise in popularity of the extreme sport at the time. And so they agreed. They began developing the skateboarding prototype, and during development, the studio decided to contact Tony Hawk, who was one of the most popular and successful skateboarders of all time, to be endorsed with the game. He agreed, and the rest, as they say, was history. That skateboarding prototype would eventually become Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, released in late August 1999 for the Sony PlayStation. It was released shortly after that year's X Games, where Tony Hawk would famously pull off the world's first 900. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater became a huge success upon its release, winning many awards and selling over 3.5 million copies. The following year in 2000, the game was ported to the Nintendo 64 by Age of Reality, the Sega Dreamcast by Treyarch, and the Game Boy Color by Natsume. And 3 years later, the game would even see release on the Nokia N-Gage as a launch title for that system. Also in the year 2000, Neversoft decided to split into 2 teams. Each would work on a different project. One team would work on the sequel to Pro Skater, simply titled Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2, and the other team would work on a 3D Spider-Man game, as Activision had just recently brought the exclusive video game rights to the character at the time. Both games were developed alongside each other, and both were released around about the same time, with Spider-Man coming out first on September 1st, 2000, and Pro Skater 2 following a few weeks later on September 20th. Both games would even include cross-promotion with each other, with Pro Skater 2 featuring Spider-Man as a secret unlockable character, and Spider-Man featuring billboards with a THPS2 logo on it. And when Spidey would crawl across it, he would say, "Tony Hawk, hey, I skated with that guy." And just like with the first Pro Skater, both of these games would also see great success, and would also be ported to multiple different platforms, such as, again, the Nintendo 64, Sega Dreamcast, the Game Boy Color, and even PC. And Pro Skater 2 would get additional ports for the Game Boy Advance and an enhanced version for the original Xbox in late 2001 called Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2X. This version included extra content not seen in other versions of the game, such as 5 brand new levels, the entire career from Pro Skater 1, and the ability to create a female custom skater. This version of the game, however, was only released in North America as a launch title for the Xbox. Also in 2001, Neversoft would begin work on their first title for the then next generation consoles, the PlayStation 2, the Xbox, and the GameCube. This game would be, of course, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3, released later that year. My personal #1 favourite game. Unlike Neversoft's previous titles, this game was made using the RenderWare engine, which was a very popular game engine during its time, used to power games such as Burnout and even the GTA games. Although primarily made with the 6th gen consoles in mind, ports for the original PlayStation and Nintendo 64 were also released by Sharper Games and Edge of Reality respectively. In fact, Pro Skater 3 would actually end up being the final game released on the N64 in August of 2002. 2 handheld ports would follow, one for the Game Boy Color and one for the Game Boy Advance, alongside PC and Mac ports. In 2002, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4 was released for the PS2, Xbox and GameCube. A PS1 port of the game by Vicarious Visions was also released and would end up being the final Tony Hawk game to be released on a 5th gen console. This game changed the structure of the series, as in the career mode it removed the traditional 2-minute timer that the last 3 games had, and allowing players to explore the environment and talk to any NPC for challenges. In 2003, Neversoft reinvented the series with Tony Hawk's Underground. This was the first game in the series to include a story mode, which followed the events of your own custom-made skater as he makes his way up in the skate world alongside your best friend, Eric Sparrow. This game also introduced a bunch of new features into the series, such as the ability to get off your board and also drive cars in a skateboarding game for some reason. A year later, the sequel, Tony Hawk's Underground 2, was released. Fug 2 was much wackier in tone than its predecessor, with the story following Tony Hawk and Bam Margera of Jackass fame kidnapping various pro skaters to participate in the World Destruction Tour. Your character was on Tony's team and the goal was to destroy stuff, I guess. In a nutshell, it's basically Jackass with skateboarding. In 2005, Neversoft once again split into 2 teams. One would work on the 7th entry in the Tony Hawk franchise, American Wasteland, and the other would work on a brand new IP called Gun, spelled in all caps. Gun was a very ambitious project for Neversoft, as it was an open-world, third-person Western shooter, which had really never been attempted before at that point. Neversoft wanted to try something new. After many years of solely working on just Tony Hawk, the team wanted to create a cinematic action-adventure shooter with a Western setting, which at the time was a very overlooked setting in gaming, and had hardly even been tackled. Both American Wasteland and Gun would see release at the end of 2005. Both games were initially released and developed for the PS2, Xbox and GameCube, however they would also later be ported to the Xbox 360 as launch titles in November of 2005. These versions were nothing more than just up-res Xbox ports. They didn't take the time to take full advantage of the 360's increased power or anything. They more or less just took the original Xbox version, slightly upgraded the textures, and added achievements. These versions could have been much more and could have been the definitive versions of both of these games, but it was obvious that they were rushed in order to make the deadline for the 360's launch date. However, the following year, in 2006, Neversoft would begin development of their first game specifically made for the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3 in mind, which would be Tony Hawk's Project 8. Called that because it was the 8th game in the series. Project 8 used a brand new game engine and reworked a lot of the core mechanics of the series. The game was a lot more grounded and realistic than past titles, and the story this time around was a very simple one. Tony's looking for the best 8 skaters. And yeah, that's about it. Despite being developed with 7th gen consoles in mind, Project 8 did make its way on both the PS2 and original Xbox, courtesy of Sharper Games. The same company who ported Pro Skater 3 over to the original PlayStation. A PSP port was also released, which was more or less the PS2 version, but on the go. 2007 was a turning point for Neversoft, as this was the year where they would transition from making yearly Tony Hawk games to yearly Guitar Hero games. How and why did they get involved with Guitar Hero? Well, the previous year, in 2006, Activision, who acquired Neversoft back in 1999, acquired the Guitar Hero series from Harmonix, who developed the first 2 games in the series. And shortly after the acquisition, they announced that Neversoft would be the ones in charge of the Guitar Hero franchise. But before working full-time on Guitar Hero, Neversoft would release one last Tony Hawk game by the end of 2007, which would be Proving Ground. Proving Ground was very, very similar to Project 8, even using the same game engine. However, it failed commercially due to it being releasing around the same time as the first entry in the Skate franchise, which was a much more realistic simulation skateboarding game, rather than the arcadey nature of Tony Hawk. It was the first time that Tony Hawk had any real competition since Thrasher Skate and Destroy, which released only about a month after the first Pro Skater in 1999. Only about 13 days after Proving Ground's release, Neversoft's first Guitar Hero game, Guitar Hero 3 Legends of Rock, would be released, and quickly became a huge smash hit. It was the first video game in history to make over $1 billion in sales. This game marked a new beginning for Neversoft. Now being done with the Tony Hawk series for good, the studio would continue to release multiple Guitar Hero games every single year. In 2008, both Guitar Hero Aerosmith and Guitar Hero World Tour would be released. Aerosmith was a spin-off game, obviously focusing on the band Aerosmith, and World Tour was the next mainline entry in the series, which would also be the game that introduced microphone and drums into the series. The following year, 2009, saw the release of 3 new Guitar Hero games: Guitar Hero Metallica in March, Guitar Hero 5 in September, and Band Hero in November. More Guitar Hero games were released that year, but these were the only 3 that were actually developed by Neversoft. All 3 of these games didn't do that well, since this was around about a time when the rhythm game genre started to become oversaturated in the market. With multiple Guitar Hero and Rock Band games coming out every single year, people were getting sick of it. And so in 2010, Neversoft limited the number of releases down to just 1. The 6th and final Guitar Hero game that Neversoft would work on, Guitar Hero Warriors of Rock, was released in September 2010, and did little to regain interest into the franchise. It ultimately flopped, and Activision cancelled any future plans for any more Guitar Hero games. Now that Guitar Hero was cancelled, Neversoft was now stuck looking for something new to work on. And during this time, one of the most anticipated games of that console generation, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3, was about to come out. Development for the final entry of the Modern Warfare trilogy was rough, and multiple studios had to come in to save the project, after the infamous Infinity Ward firings of 2010. Sledgehammer Games, a new studio at the time, was responsible for helping out Infinity Ward on most of the game. However, they still needed some help for some DLC content. And this is where Neversoft comes in. Now, it's unclear exactly why and how Neversoft got involved with Call of Duty, but in one way or another they did, and they would go on to develop the Chaos mode for Special Ops, which will be released in August 2012 for Call of Duty Elite Premium players. After this, Infinity Ward was impressed with Neversoft's work on the DLC, and they hired them to work on their next game, Call of Duty Ghost, in 2013. For this game, Neversoft was tasked on making the Extinction mode for the game, which was very similar to the popular Zombies mode featured in Treyarch's Black Ops series. Unlike the Chaos mode for MW3, Extinction mode for Ghost came out day 1 on the game's release. Call of Duty Ghost was also released as a launch title for both the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One in late 2013, with the PS4 version even coming out a few weeks before the console's actual release. However, this would be the only game Neversoft would release on these consoles, as a few months later, in May of 2014, it was announced that Neversoft would be merging with Infinity Ward to create a so-called super studio, as they called it at the time. 2 months later, in July, exactly 20 years after their founding, Neversoft officially would close their doors and burnt down a model of their iconic eyeball mascot to mark the end of the company. Shortly thereafter, president and co-founder Joel Jewett and studio director Scott Peace would leave the company shortly after the merger, and thus Neversoft Entertainment was no more.